Okay, so on to our guest. So Bradford Willke serves as the Assistant Director for Stakeholder Engagement, in the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. He leads the agency's strategic relationship formation and management for its stakeholders, partners, and customers. His team provides a front door to customers looking for CISA's capacity building and risk reduction products and services, and his programs convene industry, state, and local government, academic, and nonprofit partners to channel common goals and objectives into meaningful community of interest outcomes to manage national risk. So Bradford, welcome, and thank you for taking the time today to join us.
Hey, thanks, Joel, and love to hear all the things that you have up there going on at ACL and all the building out that you're doing to stitch together partners. That's right in my wheelhouse. You know, my namesake, Assistant Director for Stakeholder Engagement, exactly what I'm trying to do as well. COVID threw us for a loop, and so, you know, we'll do things just as much virtually as we have in the past with sort of physical proximity. But a pleasure to be with you here today, and can't look forward to very much our chat here. Hoping we get some questions from some of your members, and let's take it away. We'll see where this conversation goes.
Yeah, great, thank you. So, and along those lines, thanks for reminding me. If you do have questions, anybody in the audience, there is a question panel that you can enter your questions in, and we'll see those, and we can get to those at the end of this presentation. So please feel free to use the question Q&A panel. So great. So you did a real quick introduction there, but if you wouldn't mind maybe providing, I'd like to give you the opportunity to just kind of introduce yourself a little bit more. Maybe tell us about how you got to where you are today, and you know, maybe something you really like about working at CISA and the job that you're doing.
Yeah, I like the dynamic director that we have, Chris Krebs, and if you've never seen him, it's really hard to keep up with the running speed that he has in terms of, you know, where he's going, trying to position the agency to really own its namesake, cybersecurity and infrastructure security. That's a large mandate. That's a pretty marquee sign when you put it up there as the federal agency in charge and the lead of protecting the federal.gov space, charting the way to secure tomorrow on industrial control systems, 5G, supply chain kind of issues, defending the sort of democratic process around election security. You know, I have been working in the cybersecurity space going back about 25 years now. I think the gray in my beard kind of betrays me like you. And, you know, I really started out in the Air Force working as a law enforcement officer, but when they said, hey, do you know how to run and build databases, relational and other databases? I stuck my hand up and said yes. And it very instantly became a challenge of viruses, first generation networking, at least for the Air Force at that time, and stitching together and trying to teach cops who were very much used to arresting, you know, the traditional bad guy and the speeder and that kind of thing, exactly what to do when it came to cyber security, cyber crime, cyber malicious activity, and actually just defending that. So after that, I spent 11 years at the Software Engineering Institute. So you speak of CMMC, you know, Watts Humphreys and the SEI was doing capability maturity models for a good 35, 40 years. I think by the time I got there, and we started to build a resilience management model that the CMMC is really modeled after today. So I know exactly where we're heading with that. And I would say one of the things I picked up applying maturity models is that, you know, capability is about the easiest thing to do. It's the specific performance to get you to demonstrate that you can do a process once. Maturity tells you that you have to plan for the outcomes, build standard operating procedures, build measurement and variance and compliance analysis. You have to build governance around it. You have to build staffing and resourcing. Maturity is about the stickiness of doing it over and over. And I think it was a real proud moment when in 2010, DHS sort of recognized, hey, when we go out and do cybersecurity assessments, we're looking for that one-time performance. We're looking through an audit lens. Do they have security controls in place? It wasn't, can they manage security over time? Are they exhibiting resilient behaviors that things like maturity models expose? So I kind of took my knowledge in maturity models and said, hey, we can look at and compare facilities because of their ability to manage security, right? Do some things like repeatability and sustainment of security practices, and not just how they throw firewalls and intrusion detection and sort of the hardening of systems in place. It was whether they could actually adapt to new and emerging threats. So that was a proud moment for me, kind of being recognized for the work we had done at the Software Engineering Institute. And when I came over to CISA, and this is where I kind of I have to betray the current job I wear as stakeholder engagement, because they said, hey, what do you want to do? And I said, well, you don't need me at headquarters. You need me engaging with partners in the field on cybersecurity topics. What you really need is a cadre of cybersecurity advisors out there. And so for the first 8 years, I spent 5 years with a continuing resolution and no budget. But I spent the first 8 years really growing what we call our field presence today in this Homeland Security organization, CISA. And we now have 28 cybersecurity advisors, heading towards about another 50 after probably a year of hiring ahead. And there's I think now that I've stepped out of that job, there's a real model for what it means to work with partners in the field, engage with you on your premises, your organization to defend your supply chain, and bring you resources that the federal government is uniquely positioned to do, that takes a threat context to it that we have an ability to kind of tap into the intelligence community around. So I think it was a natural fit then for the director about a year and a half, 2 years ago, to sort of tap me and say, look, nobody thinks about customer centricity, relationship management, and all the ways in which we convene our partners in the way that you do. And so he challenged me to become this interim assistant director, otherwise known as assistant secretary in most agencies, and charged me with the responsibility of implementing the first generation customer relationship management system for all of the agency, as well as to run the formal mechanisms that you would understand as the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, 8 of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, 2 presidential advisory committees, and a whole group of folks who want to get our attention and want a seat at the table, whether it's to exchange threat information, information sharing on best practices, or really just to teach us how they see things and where you guys, for example, ACL, where you guys are going with, where you're looking at quantum and AI, the way you're going to put simulations and laboratories in there, the way you're going to strap a critical infrastructure context over it. That's the partnership model that I am trying to connect to the organization, so that we aren't the ones sort of whiteboarding our way through what we think the problem is and what we think the solution is, without talking and being industry informed, academic informed, and having partners stitched in at the hip. So I think my proudest moment is the current job that I wear as a assistant secretary or assistant director for stakeholder engagement. And quite frankly, this director is a charged ball of energy, and just keeping up with him is another good feat of strength, if you will. I think there's a lot to talk about here, so I won't go too much further, but to say that, I think arrived at this point now because there is so much partnership out there to stitch together. There's really an ecosystem of things to be done. And I think I can't wait to see what we can do together as partners. But it's almost a golden era that I almost joked a couple years back that cybersecurity has kind of reached the age of IPAs as a beer, right? Everybody's got one. Everybody thinks theirs is the best. And quite frankly, all of us probably keep our own favorites as sort of a house beer internally, but it's accessible, right? And you can find it. And so that's what my job is to do, is to make sure that all those special beers or those cybersecurity solutions out there and partnership models can really get connected with one another, and they inform how government looks at policy, looks at adoption of investment for states and local government protection and for industry. So I'm going to stop there because I sound like a stump speech, but really happy to be here with you today. And that's a little background in my tour and how I got here.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think, you've got a lot of good points there, not the least of which is Director Krebs. I think the last picture I saw of him was in red pants with with somebody who is actually quite close with Bryson Bort, who's a good friend of the foundation. And so I have that picture was on social media somewhere, and then I actually heard it on a blog or a podcast. So that's kind of funny. But also to your point about engagement, I think that's incredibly important, right? Because I think one of the things I always say is, I can attack a problem, but without the engagement, right, and getting the buy-in, it never really sticks, right? And so I think that's a lot. It sounds like a lot of what CISA is doing, and it's really a lot of what we're trying to do too, is get that engagement, that buy-in, get people involved, and own the problem. So I think that's all great. So I mean, and I appreciate that. I think that's actually, I think, mixed in with your introduction was a lot of really good information about CISA itself. So maybe one of the things I was wondering maybe is, we could talk a little bit about the resources that are available, whether it's for our members or it's just for the general public, right?
I just lost my my video feed of all.
Okay, well, I can still see you. So if you can still hear me, I think we're good. All right, a little bit of technical difficulties here. So let's see. Bradford, can you hear me? Okay.
Hey, I can. Sorry, Joel. I can hear you. I can't see you anymore, but if folks can still see me and I can definitely hear you, we can proceed.
Okay, yeah, I can still see you, so I think it's coming through. And like you said, as long as you can hear me, I think that's great. So maybe what we could do is talk a little bit about the resources that are available for not just our members, but really sort of the general public, right? What can CISA do what does CISA do for the general public?
Yeah, I think that's people are always shocked at the number of things that we do in cybersecurity that actually translate over to some things we do in infrastructure security. And I don't want you to just chalk up and think infrastructure security is physical. It really is the intersection of cybersecurity as applied to critical infrastructure. And so if we look at just the cybersecurity services, for example, we've got a pretty decent service catalog that my team is rolling out later this summer. But to kind of walk you around some of the baseball diamonds there, think of plan, do, check, and act. So we do a lot of things in terms of training that's available to the private sector. Most specifically, we have industrial control system training, virtual learning environments there. We also have hands-on classroom training on OT and ICS. And that really goes back to some of our desire about 10 years ago to really get smart and start to look at industrial control environments, specifically vulnerabilities. And so you're probably familiar with ICS CERT and the work that we've done through that emergency response team for the better part of a decade. But it's not, as you know, it's not enough just to let people know where vulnerabilities and threats are. Building capacity and so planning, whether it's training or exercises, is something that we offer as sort of two preparedness services. And then certainly out of the bookend of things where we do incident management and incident handling, which is a service that's available. Nobody really wants that service or never really wants it to have to use that as a service. But we do have a CISA Central that is a watch, warning, incident response sort of 24/7 operations center. And it will take the calls of private sector, state, local government, nonprofits, and basically assist you with the incident. In some cases, we're going to toss you to the FBI if it's truly a law enforcement matter that you want help with, meaning you want enough about the event and you want to put handcuffs on the bad guys, or you want to try to recover funds or something that's lost or go to prosecution. But if you really want technical assistance and you want aid with the recovery, or just to understand the context of maybe the malicious code that has shown up or the ransomware and exactly what it will take to root it out of your environment, we'll do that. And I bring that up because there's a big feedback loop that we do between response and back to that planning portion of the Deming cycle. So the things that we do in training, the things that we do in exercises, things we do to publish best practices like reference architectures for industrial control systems is really informed by what we see in incident response. Probably the second biggest baseball diamond is really around other preparedness types of activities that we can offer to partners, including all your members. Things like assessments. So we have 9 different cybersecurity assessments. They range from phishing campaign tests all the way to pen tests. And so yes, your government, with your permission, will do a red teaming on organizations that sign up and subscribe to that risk and vulnerability assessment. And we'll spend 2 weeks off-site and 2 weeks on-site really doing traditional red teaming. Again, capture the flag or going after information that you think needs to be sort of protected as the crown jewels, and demonstrating where, as a set of results, how we were able to pivot, what kind of vulnerabilities we took advantage of, what kind of accounts we escalated privilege on, et cetera. We do other sort of interview-based, traditional, non-on-the-wire assessments where we look at your best practices, the composition of your security teams, how you're training your workforce, and really give you recommendations for, keeping up with the Joneses. And that's, I think I mentioned in the introduction, I really cut my teeth coming over as a cybersecurity advisor. The best way to get to know an organization is to sit down, have an interview, a structured conversation around best practices, where you have leading practices, maybe where you have gaps. So a range of assessments, all free, or let's say prepaid with tax dollars available to the members. Some other ones that you might be interested in, we do some things on the industrial control system side through a suite of tools that we call our cybersecurity evaluation tool. It can be self-facilitated, meaning you can download and watch all the YouTube videos and self-apply the tool, but we also have teams that will come in and facilitate a walkthrough of your cybersecurity practices when it comes to operations technology. And then finally, the other services that we really have are more, I would say, towards partnership, right? They're not just us broadcasting one-way unidirectional content and information. And so these things are like our automated indicator sharing platform, AIS. That's technical threat indicators, TTPs, using sticks and taxi. I'm sure folks are really readily familiar with that, but the transport and the structured language that's used to describe different types of indicators of compromise and share threat information. And then we have collaboration forums, a number of them, including our a wonky named cyber and information sharing collaboration program, CISP. Really, the director calls that one the CISA hub, because it's basically where your threat experts get together with our threat and threat hunting experts, and you talk about not just admiring the problem of lessons learned of traditional events or past hacks, but really share experiences about what you see adversaries doing against things like the MITRE attack framework. So where do we need to jointly build tools? How are we doing analysis? How can we do that analysis as a team, as a sport, right? That's something that I think the director said last RSA, or maybe in our CISA summit last fall, was, cybersecurity is a team sport, and cyber is a sport too. And so we need all people rowing together. So those are just a few of the services that really make you feel more like a customer of CISA. I would say the rest of my job as the lead for stakeholder engagement is to make sure that maybe you've got industry solutions, maybe you've got better answers than we do for any one of those assessments, exercises, training, reference architectures, best practices. That's great. I want you at the table with us in one of our formal partnerships, like our coordinating councils related to critical infrastructure, talking to us about the best practices that allow you to, succeed in your business operations and your security operations. And so there's any number of ways in that model to put a chair out for all of you that allows you to sit there and convene with us in a consultative way that, again, informs the way we spend money to protect the federal.gov, the way we look at threat information, the way we look at gaps in community practices. And that also informs some of the things that we do around national campaigns like National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So I'm going to stop there because I might boil the ocean with too many things that are in the service catalog hopper. But I would say that if you're looking for, walking around looking at anything that other high-performing organizations offer as either managed or professional services, DHS CISA does them as well, and we're trying to really be very good at it because we think we have unique information that we can draw upon from the intelligence community, the way we look at cyber threat, protecting the federal.gov agencies, protecting 99 federal departments and agencies makes us have to cut our teeth and hone ourselves over and over and over. And what we try to do is pivot that information about how we protect ourselves as a leading set of practices when we talk with the private sector. By no means is that some sort of bravado statement that says we know how to do it best. That's why I set so many tables out there for you as partners so that you can join in and tell us how you're actually getting it done, which is sometimes far greater and far more mature than we have to offer. So a little bit of a walk around there of the services that we offer, Joel.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I appreciate that. And myself, I don't always realize sort of the breadth and depth of the services available from CISA, right? Like, I don't think a lot of people would sort of expect that. So appreciate that. And a lot of what you talked about there is really good. It's what I would call on the technical sort of hands-on, right? Like, it's how do we protect and how do we do this and how do I share threat information? Does CISA offer anything for executives, for example, right? So if I'm the CEO or a C-suite executive of a company, what can CISA, does CISA have anything they can offer me? And, there's a lot of talk about changing sort of company culture, right? I mean, I just read a Wall Street Journal article this morning talking about how, education, there's just not enough of it and enough people aren't paying attention to it, right? And that's a little less technical and a lot more sort of, just understanding the larger nuances and how they apply to my business. So does CISA offer anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is going to be a little less satisfying. Do we have executive courses, how to talk to a CISO if you're a CEO kind of course, or how to get your head wrapped around, using sort of a national perspective on risk management or something like that to drive your operations, or how to get in cadence with government who's trying to protect critical infrastructure through cybersecurity or other kind of, physical or industrial security practices. I think the way we kind of square off on the executive stuff is that, number one, we have a number of presidential advisory councils that we convene. That often gets us inside the OODA loop, if you will, of the headspace of CEOs as they're thinking about advising the president on national security when it comes to communications resilience or infrastructure assurance. And those are kind of the two advisory councils I help manage: the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee that goes back 37 years, and the National Infrastructure Advisory Council that goes back to the Clinton era. And these are really a way for us to put industry juggernauts, CEOs of Fortune 100 companies and others really at the table with us. They drive the study topics, they drive the policy gaps, but it's a little unsatisfying because it doesn't create an exchange where we're looking at the modern or the sort of median average gap of what CEOs might be facing, what's on their needs for a corporate scorecard related to cyber risk indicators, or a balanced scorecard with cyber information kind of feeding that, like they look at other financial risk, for example. So in that case, I think what the director has said recently, and I would say this is the last year, but again, federal government, recent can be decades sometimes. What he said is, we sit on some exquisite information, whether it is threat information, mountains of data related to private sector assessments that we've done, large resilience assessments, and we're not necessarily capitalizing on the information in a way that is informing the C-suite. And I think you bring this up rightfully, and I think you probably acknowledge this yourself in the way that you're positioning the educational work that you're doing out of the foundation. And that is, if you don't sort of get, we've said this for decades, but if you don't get the buy-in, the sponsorship, that's certainly going to be an impediment. If you don't get their head wrapped around cyber being an equivalent risk area on the order of financial or loss of market position kind of risk, we've really lost, I think, an ability to then translate and have them commit to investment that is going to drive operations, drive capabilities to be implemented, drive the maturity that we need to see happen, and even permit things like partnership. And I know what we've said is public-private partnership is the end goal, but I think what we said it's a shared responsibility, right? Those both sound like lip service, and I think when you go to a CEO and say, no, what I'm asking you to do is allow me to commit the agency's data when we when we stop the bad guy, or we fail to stop the ransomware, or we look at the lesson learned after an attack and a compromise, I need you to commit to me that I can work with the partners like law enforcement, like CISA, like state fusion centers, like ISACs, and exchange that, because this is really a shot at any of us is a shot at all of us. And so C-suite education is something we're starting to take on. Our Office of Chief Counsel, for example, is trying to really educate about how the legislative authorities that we really have as CISA can protect organizations when they exchange information with us, when they share that they've had a compromise or they need incident response, how they can exchange best practices with us, which to somebody else might not look like a leading practice, and have some safe haven for doing that. On the other side, as I mentioned, we're sitting on all this data, and what we've got to do is be able to make the translation to the C-suite all the way up to the CEO to say, you know what, that may look like a Ripple 20 ICS vulnerability, but what it really means is that your organization has maybe missed how to select vendors based on security requirements and unique capabilities. I think like you're describing in the foundation, where some of the vendor's maturity is immature, if you will, because it doesn't have access to labs, simulators, it doesn't get beat up on before it's put into production. And I think, again, that's where if you can commit and convince CEOs that it's not about writing the best specification, because I've still got to own this thing that might have not had the best security built in. I need to partner with folks that are continuing to improve the ecosystem by which these systems will exist. And as you know, that ecosystem is not just four walls and the ceiling of an enterprise. It is cloud, it is extended globally, it is lots of supplier chains and lots of third parties. And I think, again, that's where we're trying to educate the C-suite, but it's more conversations these days than it probably is executive training. And I think, again, if there are masters out there like the foundation here who really have a good recipe for executive training, we just want to pivot people over to that. We don't want to compete with that and say that government needs to be the one to train those executives.
Yeah, no, great. So what I'd like to do, maybe let's pivot a little bit now towards sort of COVID-19, right? I think this is kind of everybody's favorite topic now, since we're all still sort of stuck at home here. But I mean, I know CISA has been doing quite a bit in COVID-19, right? And there's two sort of areas I'd like to explore. The first one is really around, well, the two of them are threats, right? So what has CISA seen in around COVID-19, but then really sort of how they've responded, how you, CISA, have responded to COVID-19. So maybe we could start with the response side first, right? So I think, because in talking with a couple of folks that work in CISA, I was certainly amazed that there's a lot of work being done with HHS, for example, right? Like, so you don't expect CISA to be intimately involved with HHS, but you were. And so maybe if you could just spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the immediate things that CISA did when COVID-19 hit, not necessarily from a threat perspective, but more from a collaborative and working together perspective.
Yeah, I think when you and I were talking last week, what struck me after we hung up was would have loved this year not to have a pandemic right after an Iran tensions and then a large set of Microsoft vulnerabilities. And what I was going to suggest to you last week was, the Iran tensions that we had around January 9th was equally something that could have become where we are in a pandemic, where we see the changing risk landscape, eclipsing events, things out of your control necessarily, and threats often are like Iran and what happened to General Soleimani there in Iraq, where he was hit by a U.S. drone strike, and then all of us knowing that Iran may not be able to strike back in a very proportional manner, military on military. They're likely to shoot past the military with cyber weapons and have an effect on our U.S. critical infrastructure. And they've been known to have capabilities to have that kind of reach in asymmetric warfare. So I thought about that and the question of like, what is our resolve? How do we see things on the threat side and how do we respond? So I'd love to talk about that sometime with you too, because I think that was a great coalition that we kind of stuck together and said, okay, as you wake up on January 9th, the world has to look a little bit differently to you, because we have kicked a hornet's nest over in the Middle East. Usually that means that there is going to be some military stand up on two sides of a border. And usually it doesn't mean much for us stateside. And in fact, I think more and more these things have a cyber connection to them and a defender connection. You mentioned, collaboration up front, and I would say collective defense is something that should be on the mind of all of us, and I think is. And so, how do you operationalize that? So I know I'll get off the Iran stuff really quickly, but I think it was an interesting 5 or 6 weeks before COVID started, where we were trying to say, look, it's January 10th is now not normal. It's not like January 8th or 9th. We have stirred something up. What you're likely to see is that Iran does have cyber capabilities, but they likely are going to use the next 6 to 8 weeks to use proxy actors and sympathetic actors who will go after websites, because that's a low-hanging fruit for defacement. You will see hacktivism. You will see denial of service attacks. But if you're waiting for, if you're looking for, is this Iran's military apparatus doing this, and the IGRC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, it's probably not, right? They have a National Security Council like we do, and they're probably sitting back saying, what is a proportional action in cyber means and methods that we have? And they're probably going to wait about 8 weeks. And then we have seen they have reach in Saudi Arabia and other kind of examples where they can use destructive malware, wiper malware, not just ransomware around a sanction, for example. And so I'm sorry for bringing this up, because I know you asked me about COVID, but it was a very interesting episode where we knew instantly that the private sector would have as much information about how something was not normal the next day. And one of the things that we expected not to be normal was what this immediate use of proxy actors would look like and how they would go after defacements and denial of service. And we actually saw that in a couple cases. But we also knew that if the IRGC was really interested in sort of waiting pensively and looking for a proportional response that was going to hit US infrastructure, they were likely going to throttle back on some of the things that they were doing, leveraging things like ransomware, again, because of the sanctions, trying to monetize ransomware. They were probably likely to pull back. And I think from a network defender's perspective, what we were asking was, okay, you've characterized the routine threats that show up and beat on your front edge. Has anything changed? Have you seen a throttle back? Have you seen people go out and touch the access that they've had as an adversary, where things might be beaconing a botnet or something that you can see on the periphery through a supply chain? And we were just about there. And I think what you saw was they did some things in region that looked very proportional to them. Gave some save face kind of moments where they kind of shelled US encampments and bases overseas. And as horrible as that was, because there was some traumatic brain injury and stuff like that from the shellings, they kind of considered it a done matter, and they didn't really fire fully their cyber weapons. I think had the world not been faced with COVID, where we kind of all needed to collectively pause, assess the safety of our citizens, we might have seen greater effect on the cyber side. So sorry for ignoring that, but or taking that little diatribe there, but let me pivot to COVID. And I think you're right. There were a couple things that we immediately did that were kind of in recognition that the pandemic, while we are not the medical side of things, was going to be unique in sort of a risk landscape on a national scale for others. And certainly we were looking at some immediate effects of decreased commodity demands, increased commodity demands on things like sanitizers, PPE, disinfectants, now testing. And you might say, well, what does that mean in terms of cybersecurity? Well, every time one of those spikes in demand goes up, a supply chain really has to rock and roll into place. Manufacturers have to go. And the last thing I think we want to see is an underprotected supply chain an inventory management system that is denial of service or compromised, an adversary go off and ransomware us, while we're already in N-1 condition. And you brought up Health and Human Services, and it was about 3 or 4 weeks in where we started to really talk about the only way out of COVID, and it still remains that way, is through medical countermeasures that have yet to prove themselves out, or a vaccine that still may be 10 to 12 months away. Dr. Fauci says December of this year. That might be the first batch of vaccines. I don't think that's 350 million doses for everybody in the United States. And I don't think, I think it'll be 6 months before probably even me, I get my shot in the arm once the vaccine's actually ready. So that's a long way of saying, as we protect the organizations that are delivering healthcare as a primary care system, which are already under stress, their physicians are out there working in the pandemic environment. They've got short supply on the medical side. We need to protect their supply chains. We need to protect their records management systems. And then there's a whole side of this with Health and Human Services as a lead agency for public health and the healthcare system to be able to protect the way to the vaccine. And so you may have heard the president use the words Operation Warp Speed. That's really charging energy into the way in which race to the vaccine, or vaccine solutions, if you will. But on the way to doing that, we need to protect the researchers, the people who are going to do human trials and the testing results. Every cyber attack that could step us back a week is going to create issues for us, is going to create distrust in the information that we're using as results in those on the way to a vaccine. And so we need a very high performing, high secure system. And so we started to really work early with Health and Human Services, look at the companies that were going to be delivering the vaccine, doing laboratory science, and then those that are on the periphery, right? There's a lot of folks who, you look at the National Science Foundation's database and you find a ton of people doing medical research. To someone like China, Russia, or some other cyber adversary who does not want us to get to the solution, or maybe they want to get to the solution first and hold everybody hostage to a certain price point or to availability, they're probably looking at anybody who's doing research thinking that they're doing COVID-related research. And so there are a number of people sort of swept up by the circumstances. So what we're doing is we're making sure that our services like vulnerability scanning, like pen tests, like threat information sharing, like the assessments I mentioned, are really available and prioritized for those companies. And I think we're going to be doing that all the way through the vaccine. And I would say it's a model for the way we've defended up to the elections in 2020, the way we looked at the 2018 round of midterm elections. But it's a team sport. Those companies are investing, and certainly they may just want, in some cases, some of the threat information that we have coming out of the intelligence community. They may want us to look at their front edge so that they can spend their time, on the business side of things. And so that's just some of the work that we're doing under COVID. I could go into more, but I think we've got other questions that are probably just as entertaining. But I hope that gives you a little bit of also a picture of it takes a village. And I know that sounds wonky and hokey, but really there is all sorts of collaboration we're trying to have that puts everybody at the table, levels the perspective on threat and vulnerability and the best practice and the way ahead. And I think just as a final sort of example of that, I've been convening 25 calls since March 12th. We were doing them every Tuesday and Thursday, but we do nationwide calls every Tuesday now from 3 to 4:15 Eastern. Pretty much anybody who's got a critical infrastructure designation or the phone number can dial in. And right up front, like a news feed, I am on there projecting what is the current federal guidance, what is the infection rate of COVID. I bring in CDC and HHS speakers. I also bring in speakers from the FBI, our own Assistant Director for Cybersecurity, Brian Ware. The director is always on that call, and we are always talking about the changed digital landscape, the digital transformation, the displacement of the workforce, and this Operation Warp Speed and what we need to protect our way to a vaccine. And there is so much cyber going on. The bad guys are going after the fraud aspects. That's the simple clickbait, clickjacking, and fraud attempts for taking advantage of your charitable mind and your dollars, all the way to they're following us to where we are in the endpoints of our business operations, which is a computer like this with a collaboration tool like the environment we're using, knowing that the enterprise information and some of the crown jewels are sitting out here in a less protected home area network. And so we're trying to get telework practices, trying to get secure remote workforce practices out there as fast as we can. We do not have all the solutions, and so we will take whatever is working for you and work with you to kind of package those up and, as a force multiplier. So that's a little bit of a walk around tour of what we're doing on COVID, and so much more we could talk about on that front.
Right. And I think, it's interesting. I like the collaboration piece, right, at the government level. And I think you also brought it up with the basically everybody's working from home now, right? So, and I think when we were talking on the prep earlier last week, one of the topics I want to really kind of get to today too is, it sounds like the threat landscape hasn't really evolved, right? I mean, there's no new attacks, nothing different than what's sort of been seeing. I think maybe the numbers are just going up, and the attack surface has sort of expanded because everybody's working at home. But let's skip over the parents and the working from home, and let's get to the kids, right, who are now going to be, learning from home, right? So, for example, here in Virginia, Fairfax County just sent notice out yesterday or early this week saying, okay, you now have a choice. Your kid can either learn from home every day of the week, or we can do it 3 on, 2 off, or 2 on, 3 off. I can't remember which one it was. So there's an entirely different sort of threat vector, if you will, right? Like now it's the kids, right? And so have you put any partnerships in place with the Department of Education? Are you working with, any local school systems, or like how's CISA sort of managing or working with that?
Yeah, we are. And I think one of the nice things here is we're piggybacking on a lot of the work we've done with K through 12, but on the educator side, right? I mean, I think what you're talking more is about the superintendent, the administration of schools, and the IT backbone, and some of the, the broadband and other kind of connectivity challenges that they're facing right now as they extend that, what might be called emergency academic learning, to real distance learning, secure distance learning. And so what we've got is we've got a number of partnerships that we've worked on for years to get cybersecurity education into the hands of K through 12 educators, bring it into the STEM curriculum and kind of train it that way. And now what we're doing is we're kind of looking at that model and saying, can we, through the faculty, through the educator, get to the folks that are actually supporting them with their IT networks, the distance learning platforms. At the same time, yes, we have, I would say, early conversations going on with the Department of Education, but also other educational systems, throughout the states that have been the early adopters of some of this. I think we've trained 16,000 teachers and hit about 3.5 million students with some of the curriculum that we've been able to support over the last, I would say, a dozen years, but I think just in the last year we hit something like a milestone of 16,000 teachers trained in some of the cybersecurity education curriculum we've got. So by extension, through those same relationships that we have, it's not just with the faculty and the educator, it's with the school system who has invested and designated that faculty to be the representative on that curriculum with us, but the connection was already back to the school system. And so, several 100,000 school systems that we're working with. Let me say that again, because there's only 112,000 municipal agencies in the United States, of which there are about 70,000 school districts. So I would say a good 10 to 20,000 school districts are already plugged into us in some way. We're going to kind of leverage that that front door as a way to get to get kind of the reach out that you're talking about. Sure. I think Department of Education is another great way to do that. But I think there are other useful coalitions. The National Governors Association is somebody who is looking at this. And I know I'm half answering your question, Joel, but I think there's actually probably a better front door through governors and through the National Association of Counties and others, the governors, particular like Governor John Bell Edwards, because they already know what something like ransomware means in a multi-school district approach, right? Last summer, John Bell Edwards down in Louisiana faced 5 of 55 or so school districts really being jammed up by ransomware, and knows that if he has that as the schools go to do distance learning, there is going to be nothing but trouble and no education really going on. At the same time, you know, some of the practices that we're working on about secure, you know, remote access are really not. They're about secure use of the collaboration tools like Zoom and Teams and Adobe Connect and Citrix. It's actually talking back to, you know, the actual education platforms. So what we need to do is start working with the Blackboards and the distance learning platforms and making sure that they are thinking about, you know, security provisioning. And again, it's I think you and I talked about this, but the real inflection here, the real difference is that for a decade, we've been talking about, please don't take your untrusted laptop, bring your own device into my corporate environment. Now we've got the reverse, which is every corporate endpoint is sitting out there. Not 3% of our workforce is using our VPN and secure remote technology. We want 90 to 94, 95% of our workforce doing that, which takes corporate assets and puts them into a potential Wild West, or at least not an enterprise grade network, considering the home area network or a local area network. So there's a lot to be done on this front, both from a secure workforce, also from distance learning. I would say we're looking for, and I would toss this back to you, maybe as a way to not answer your question further, which is if you find high performance, if any one of your members here finds high performance school districts that you hear rolling out a really credible security management plan, how they're going to secure their way and build resilience, how they're going to look at redundancy, how they're going to look at quality of service, how they're going to look at educating parents who I think have to take some responsibility as new IT managers to help their son or daughter kind of, you know, get that security built into the way they operate online. I think we're looking for those conversations, and if you find them, we're willing to work with them and build them into some of the best practice guidance that we would put out there and distribute. We've got, you know, great distribution mechanisms, great partnerships, but I think what we do is we cannot presumptively look at all the best practices because we don't field those technologies in the way that a K through 12 environment is, and we're not really lashed up to the vendors and the developers in the same way we are with other enterprise or IT OT technology. So this is a new area for us that we have to come up to speed really fast on. What better way than to talk to the school districts that are high performers?
Yeah, I agree. And I think we could probably spend an entire hour talking about how to do that, right? And the different nuances and the different reasons to do that. You know, because you'll get away from, not get away from, but on top of the security aspect is the privacy piece, right? Like, so making sure that kids, a more vulnerable population, aren't, you know, being, you know, exploited, or they're not being taken advantage of, those kinds of things. So we've got about 4 minutes left. So what I'd like to do, we've got a handful of questions to see how many we can get to here. So we'll pivot here to questions. The first one I'd like to bring up here is a question here is there an organization within CISA that reaches out to very small mom and pop sized businesses to help them understand the necessity to establish cyberspace security measures?
Mine. So I love to be selfish about this one, but I really encourage you to go out to CISA.gov and just type in, look for our Cyber Hub. That's an easy way to find all the cybersecurity services. But my group started to put together what we call the Cybersecurity Essentials late last year. I think we rolled out you know, something in November. We talked about it at our last summit, September last year. And what we've done is with folks like the Global Cyber Alliance, that's Phil Reitinger, he's a past Undersecretary of Homeland Security, with the Cyber Readiness Institute, that's a group out in Colorado, with NIST, with the Small Business Administration. What we said was every organization at any level of resource, sole proprietor on up, should have a basic cyber hygiene, a safe, basic cyber understanding of the risk in which they are attaching to the second they go online, the second they invite a payment processor into their business, the second they have somebody do third-party record management. So yes, we have this great Cyber Essentials platform. It talks about 6 pillars and basically as a paved way to 6 toolkits that really what we need is if you have small businesses or local government, which look like small businesses often, under-resourced, nobody on point with cybersecurity management, always getting a third party to patch systems, provision users. We would love to hear about some of the best practices you have. We'll add it to that toolkit, but it is a great 6-rung, 6-step toolkit. It was really charged out of the director's recognition that ransomware is not something to you can't just respond against ransomware. You have to solve a minimal level of competence, education. Everybody has to have, I guess another way of saying it is, we want everybody to have a 7th or 8th grade level of digital literacy, and we think Cyber Essentials gets you to that. It takes stock in how you as a leader need to understand your role as a sole proprietor or a small business manager, tells you how to talk to the staff. It tells you where you can assign things out to the technical folks, including third parties. It's a wonderful thing, and we think it's snackable. We think it's Schoolhouse Rock of cybersecurity. It's very easily approachable. It's plain language, but you tell us whether it's valuable, and I think that's absolutely targeted at small, medium businesses.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. So about a minute left here. So last question that we'll pose, and then anything we can't get to, maybe we'll work with you to get them answered and get some answers back. But this kind of goes back to the threats, the evolving landscape. Have you seen a marked rise in attacks on hospitals since COVID-19 hit, or is it still just the same usual level of ransomware?
Nope. We've seen definitely people beat up on hospitals, and I think one, it's not just ransomware. It's looking at the way in which the facilities are actually having to do remote management of everything to the HVAC system, some of the diagnostic tools, some of the payment processing. We have definitely, this is not analogous to putting more sensors there telling us that there's more going on. It's not just because we have additional sensors and watching the space of the attack surface. We are literally seeing more attacks against hospital systems, against those research facilities, and all those, the Quest and other kind of diagnostic laboratories that are really supporting the way through all of this. And that's kind of really unfortunate. I don't know what mankind gets out of that kind of attacking itself in the middle of a pandemic. But honestly, follow the money and you'll find that bad guys are going to monetize their way ahead and attack where the shifting landscape is. So it's also, and I would just say, it's also recognition of healthcare is the one system that couldn't take a day off, right, from the pandemic, just like energy. And so when non-essential businesses sort of take themselves offline, and I don't mean that they did, they got safely shut down by governor's orders, for example, hospitals could not. And so if you want to follow who is still at risk, who still needs to be a high performer, high availability, the bad guys knew that hospitals were a mark.
Right. All right, well, great. I think that's all the time we have today. So Bradford, absolutely a pleasure to talk to you today. I appreciate you taking the time, spending with us and our members, giving us some great information on CISA, how you guys play together, how we can help you guys, and we look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I really appreciate what your community is doing, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk with you today. I'll be around for whenever you want another one of these conversations or your membership wants to reach out. Thanks so much.
Sure. All right, great. Thank you. All right, thank you everybody for joining. And as I mentioned earlier, a copy of this recording will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So take a look out, keep an eye out for that. And thank you for coming.